The Nevada sun was brutal that afternoon, casting long shadows across the highway as Mike Tyson cruised down the open road in his matte black Rolls-Royce. Sunglasses on, music low, thoughts drifting. It had been a quiet day, until the flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. He sighed. Again? Mike pulled over, hands calmly on the wheel. The officer approached slowly, sunglasses reflecting the car like a mirror. His hand hovered near his holster. "License and registration," the cop barked. Mike didn't flinch. "Sure," he said, voice steady. "Can I reach into the glove box?" The officer nodded, tense. Mike moved slowly, handed over his papers. The cop barely glanced at them before asking, "Whose car is this?" Mike raised an eyebrow. "Mine." "Really?" the officer said, with a smirk. "A bit flashy for someone like you, don't you think?" Mike's jaw tightened. He'd heard that tone before, years ago in Brooklyn, in locker rooms, in courtrooms. But this time, the man didn't realize who he was speaking to, and that was his first mistake. The officer leaned in closer, scanning the interior like he expected to find something illegal. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" Mike didn't move right away. "Am I being detained?" "Step out of the vehicle," the cop repeated, this time with his hand fully resting on the grip of his pistol. Mike exhaled slowly, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stepped out. Even in casual clothes, plain white tee, black jeans, gold chain, he still had the unmistakable build of a fighter. The kind of presence that made people pause, even if they didn't know why. But the cop didn't pause. He saw only what he wanted to see, a black man in an expensive car. "Turn around," the cop ordered. "Hands on the hood." Mike stared at him, calm but unimpressed. "You sure about this?" "Don't test me," the cop snapped. "You people think money puts you above the law." Mike gave a bitter laugh. "You people." The officer grabbed Mike's wrist, twisting it behind his back. Mike winced, not from pain, but from restraint, the kind that came from a lifetime of holding back when everything in him screamed to fight. Then, from the other side of the highway, a passing driver hit the brakes, rolled down the window, and shouted, "Yo, that's Mike Tyson." The cop froze. "What did you say?" he muttered. The driver leaned out farther. "That's Iron Mike, bro. Mike Tyson. What the hell are you doing?" Recognition spread across the officer's face like a slow, ugly stain. His grip loosened. He stepped back. Mike turned around, staring directly into the cop's eyes. "Still think I'm just another black man?" The silence that followed was heavier than any punch Mike had ever thrown. The video hit the internet within an hour. The driver who recognized Tyson had filmed everything, from the cop's aggressive tone to the moment of stunned realization. By sunset, it was trending worldwide. The department scrambled to do damage control. A statement was released claiming it was a routine traffic stop, but nobody was buying it. News outlets looped the footage on every channel. Talk shows debated it. Civil rights groups issued statements. Tyson's name was everywhere, not for boxing this time, but for being a mirror to America's ugly truth. Meanwhile, Tyson sat quietly in his Vegas home, watching the storm from a distance. He didn't smile. He wasn't angry either. He was just tired. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from friends, lawyers, activists, journalists. Everyone wanted a quote, a headline, an angle. But Tyson stayed silent until he posted a single tweet. No one should have to be famous to be treated with respect. The tweet hit like a knockout punch. That night, the police chief called personally. Apologies, explanations, promises of investigation. But Tyson didn't want words. He wanted change. So he agreed to speak. Not in court, not to the media, but at a local community center where young black boys were learning to navigate a world that too often saw them as threats before it saw them as humans. He stood in front of them, not as a legend, but as a man who'd been judged by his skin before his name. A week later, Tyson stood at the front of the crowded community center. It was a small room, filled with young black men and boys, their faces a mix of hope and doubt. They were the ones who didn't make headlines unless something went wrong. And in their eyes, Tyson wasn't just a boxer. He was proof that greatness didn't shield you from injustice. He looked around the room, meeting their eyes. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Mike took a deep breath. "I've spent my whole life fighting. In the ring, outside of it against my own demons. But no fight was ever like this. The room fell silent, every ear tuned to his words. A week ago, I was just another black man on the street, trying to live my life. And then I wasn't. I was just a target, because of my skin. But this ain't just about me. It's about every one of you. He let the words settle before continuing. Every time you walk out that door, you might have a target on your back. And it's not right. The tension in the room was palpable, like the storm before a fight. Young eyes flickered between the floor and Mike's face, some angry, some resigned. They were used to the injustice. They had learned to live with it. But Tyson wasn't done. He stepped forward, his voice rising. I'm tired of waiting for change to come. I've seen enough. It's time to make them see us as we are, as men, as brothers, as fathers. We don't fight just to survive. We fight to change the damn rules. His eyes locked with the crowd. I'm not just telling you to stand up. I'm telling you to make them listen. Don't let them tell you your worth. Don't let them decide your future. You decide it. You fight for it. A murmur spread through the room, a quiet, burning fury beginning to rise. Tyson stepped back, his gaze unwavering. And we fight together. A young man in the front row stood up, his fists clenched. You're right, Mike. We've been quiet too long. Another stood. It's time to take a stand. The energy in the room shifted. No longer helpless, but resolute. Tyson had ignited something in them. The fire that had been smoldering for years began to burn brightly. And it wasn't just for themselves. It was for everyone who had been silenced. But just as the hope started to rise, a police officer entered the back of the room. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot. He didn't belong here. Not in this moment. Mike saw him, but didn't flinch. The room fell quiet again. The officer took a step forward, his badge glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mike Tyson, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I came to apologize for what happened. The room held its breath. Tyson's expression was unreadable. Apology doesn't change what's been done. You don't get to just say sorry and walk away. The officer's face reddened, but he stood his ground. I know. I can't undo it, but I want to try to make things right. I can't change the past, but I want to do better. We all should. Mike stepped toward him, his presence overwhelming. You can start by making sure you never treat another man like that again. And you make sure your brothers in blue know they can't get away with it. Not anymore. The officer nodded, his eyes downcast. I will. I swear. The tension didn't ease. It was raw, palpable, but it was a beginning. The officer, caught between his own guilt and the collective gaze of the room, understood that the price of real change wasn't just an apology. It was action. Mike nodded once, his face softening. Then make sure it counts. The officer turned and left, his footsteps echoing through the silence. Tyson watched him go, then turned back to the young men in the room. His voice, now low but resolute, carried the weight of what had just happened. Change isn't easy, but it starts here. And it starts with us. The room erupted in applause, slow at first, then louder, more confident. Mike Tyson had done more than stand up for himself. He had inspired a room full of young men to stand up for themselves too. And for the first time in a long while, the world saw them not as threats, but as the fighters they were always meant to be. Mike's speech had barely ended when the room's door slammed open. Two more officers walked in, their expressions dark, their presence heavy. They weren't here to apologize. The officer who had pulled Mike over earlier stood in the back, now visibly sweating. The newcomer, a senior officer by the insignia on his uniform, stepped forward, his voice calm but loaded with a warning. We've had enough of this spectacle, he said, addressing the room, but his eyes never left Mike. This isn't a place for vigilante justice. You've stirred things up enough. Now you'll see what happens when people like you think they can challenge the system. A cold shiver ran through the room. The boys who'd stood with Tyson now took a half step back, unsure of what would come next. Mike stood his ground, his eyes narrowing. Are you threatening me? Tyson asked, his voice ice cold. The officer didn't respond directly, but nodded subtly to his partner. That was enough. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the room as a large, bulky officer kicked over a chair, rushing toward Mike. Tyson instinctively took a step back, his eyes flashing with the readiness of a fighter. But before the cop could lay a hand on him, Mike was already moving. A quick pivot, a swift jab to the officer's gut, just enough to stop him in his tracks. The officer staggered back, but Mike wasn't done. With one sharp move, Tyson had the officer pinned against the wall, his body weight pressing down on the man's chest. "You really want to do this?" Tyson growled. "I've been in worse situations than this." The senior officer's eyes widened, his face turning red. "You think you can just assault an officer and walk away from this? You're going to regret this." But Mike wasn't looking for an easy way out. He knew exactly what was at stake. "This is bigger than me," he said, "and you can't bully me into silence. You think you can scare me into backing down? You got the wrong guy." The tension was unbearable now, the whole room holding its breath. Just then, the sound of sirens wailing outside the building cut through the silence. Reinforcements were on their way. But before anyone could react, Tyson turned his attention back to the senior officer. "If you want to make this right," Tyson said, his voice low and dangerous, "you'll make sure this never happens again. You'll fix the system that's broken." The officer paused, eyes darting between Tyson and his partner. The senior officer, visibly shaken, finally nodded. "You've made your point, Tyson, but we're not done here. Not by a long shot." With a final look, Mike released the officer, pushing him away. "I'm done with your threats. You'll see me again. But it won't be as your punching bag." As the two officers retreated, the room erupted in a mix of cheers and anxious murmurs. Mike's body was still tense, but he knew this fight was far from over. The aftermath of that night was more than just media buzz. The higher-ups in the department, desperate to maintain control, tried to sweep the whole thing under the rug. But the footage, the tension, the challenge wasn't something they could erase. Tyson, now a public symbol of defiance, wasn't backing down. And with every rallying cry he led, every speech he made, he became more than just a fighter in the ring. He became a voice for justice, a symbol of standing tall in the face of an unforgiving system. And the authorities? They soon realized that, for all their power, they couldn't erase what had already been seen. This version definitely brings in more direct physical tension, a moment of almost physical confrontation, and leaves the door open for even bigger consequences down the line, a standoff between Tyson and the system itself. As Mike Tyson stood in the center of the room, the officers retreated, but the room's atmosphere was anything but calm. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every breath, every glance, carried the weight of what had just happened. The two officers who had walked in were now gone, but Mike knew they wouldn't let this go. This wasn't just about him. This was about the system, about the power that the police believed they held over people like him. Tyson's eyes scanned the room. The young men, who had once looked to him for inspiration, now saw him as a symbol of defiance. But what had started as a rally for change was quickly escalating into something much more dangerous. As Tyson stood there, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his lawyer, but before he could read it, the building's front doors slammed open. A group of men in black suits stormed in. Not police officers, but figures who reeked of power, authority, and intimidation. They wore the look of people who had seen it all and knew how to bend the law without breaking it. They were higher-ups, the ones who could make problems disappear with a signature. Mike felt the temperature in the room drop. He wasn't just up against cops anymore. This was the system at its most ruthless. One of the men, taller and more imposing than the others, stepped forward, his cold eyes fixed on Tyson. "Mike Tyson, we've been looking for you," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "You've made quite a spectacle of yourself." Mike didn't flinch. "What do you want?" The man smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was a threat, hidden behind a veneer of civility. "You've stirred up enough trouble. You've made it clear that you think you can challenge the system, but you don't know who you're dealing with." Mike took a step forward, his presence unyielding. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I'm not backing down." The man's smile faded, and the room's air grew thick. "You think you're untouchable? That your fame will protect you? You'll soon learn that even the mightiest fall. You've embarrassed us in front of the entire country, and now there will be consequences." Mike's pulse quickened, but his voice was steady. I've been through worse than this. You can threaten me all you want, but you won't break me. The man's eyes narrowed. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore, Tyson. You've made this about all the wrong people. And now they're going to see what happens when someone like you tries to expose the truth. The silence that followed felt like a countdown. Tyson wasn't sure what they had planned, but he knew it wouldn't be pretty. Suddenly, one of the suited men pulled out a thick envelope, placing it in Mike's hands. He looked down at it. The weight of it felt ominous. Take it, the man said coldly. Consider it a settlement. A way for you to keep your name clean. This is how things are handled, quietly. We'll make sure nothing else happens to you, as long as you stay out of our way. Tyson opened the envelope, scanning the contents. It was a deal, a bribe, a promise of silence. They were trying to buy him off. Without a word, Mike tore the envelope in half and dropped the pieces to the floor. I'm not your puppet. Not now. Not ever. The tension in the room escalated. One of the men stepped forward, his hand twitching toward his jacket, clearly ready to escalate things physically. Mike's hand instinctively shifted to his side, preparing for a fight. He knew what came next, but he wasn't going to let them scare him. Just as the suited man moved to make his move, there was a sudden burst of sound from outside, the unmistakable roar of helicopters approaching. Damn it, the man hissed. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. But it was too late. The media was already outside. The world was watching, and the pressure was mounting. Tyson's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the news. Breaking. Mike Tyson's confrontation with police leads to an internal investigation. Tyson smiled, his eyes blazing with determination. You've already lost, he said. The man in the suit narrowed his eyes. We'll see about that. His voice was low, dangerous. But before the man could make another move, the doors flew open again, this time with a group of reporters rushing in, cameras flashing. The men in suits hesitated, realizing their position was no longer secure. Their power, their anonymity, was slipping away. The public was now fully aware of the corruption, and the tide was turning. Mike didn't back down. He stood tall in the center of it all, surrounded by reporters, his image broadcast to the world. You want to fight me? He said, voice cutting through the tension. This is the fight you can't win. Not with me. Not with anyone. I'm not backing down. You can't silence me anymore. The cameras clicked and rolled, capturing every word. The truth was now exposed for all to see. Ending. The fallout was inevitable. The department tried to bury the scandal, but it was too late. The media storm was too loud. The investigation began, not just into the officers' actions, but into the corruption that ran through the system. Mike Tyson had done more than stand up to an officer. He'd sparked a movement. In the weeks that followed, protests erupted in cities across the nation, led by young people who had seen what had happened to Tyson. The fight for justice, long delayed, was now in motion. And Mike Tyson? He became more than just a boxer. He became the face of defiance, the one who wouldn't let the system crush him or anyone else. The story of that day was never forgotten. It was a reminder, sometimes the greatest fights aren't fought in the ring. They're fought in the streets.